All right, here we go. This is Ungovernable. I'm Matt. This is Jocelyn. We got an awesome show tonight. We're talking the economy. You want to do the honors while I get the last stream shared with the wine?
Yeah, this is what beautiful with an I.
Yeah.
It's a Malbec. It's a really beautiful label, though.
Yep.
You're right. You just showed it to me. You picked this one out, right?
I did.
I've got to. It's actually got to be opened up, though.
Yep. So we are going to be talking economy tonight. Just reminder, like, comment, subscribe, share. We are live every single Monday at 9 p.m. Eastern. We have an awesome guest tonight, so I'm not going to hold him up too long. You can keep opening that up while we invite Clint. How are you, brother?
I'm good. I'm super tired, man. I've been on the road nonstop. I went to PorkFest in New Hampshire and then to Michigan to speak at the LP with Justin Amash, and then I was in Vegas for Freedom Fest for the past 4 days. So I am gassed, but I am here and I am ready to talk economics to wake everybody up with my deep economic analysis.
I was gonna say we are amongst royalty because you haven't made it in the political sphere until the Southern Poverty Law Center has issued a hit piece with you as one of the main pieces. Now, obviously,
I knew this was coming.
Dude, you've made it. You're like, as soon as the smears start, like, you're obviously touching a nerve.
I mean, I'm gonna be honest with you. Like, as honored as I am to get their ire, I really didn't think I was prominent enough to get a mention like this. Not to mention like a significant portion of the article. I was like, wow, this is really astonishing. So I guess as many people have said, that must mean you're doing something good. So I'll just keep doing it.
Yeah. I think it's just that you're a white dude wearing a beanie and you fit the profile. I think it's what it was.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in fairness, they were very clever not to label me anything bad. They just stuck to associations because I do have resources and I probably would have sued them had they actually called me like a white nationalist or something. I've been like, on what grounds are you calling me a white nationalist? It's so detached from reality, but instead they just made it off of my association of having been on shows with Ryan Dawson twice. It's like, ooh. So crazy. And for the record, I don't think Ryan Dawson is a white nationalist either. But it's all guilt by association bullshit.
Of course. Well, no, dude, Ryan's the freaking man. Like, I mean, like, if you're watching this and you haven't seen Ryan Dawson speak, you got to freaking catch it at least once because he's like a freaking tornado. I mean, like, he's like, and the amount of shit that he has just at his fingertips, like the pull up knowledge wise, like, I know his positions on Israel and the Israeli political state obviously touches a nerve, but
we've talked about that.
Yes.
Okay, now I know who it is.
Yeah. No, Ryan's an awesome dude. So you're in good company.
He is reviled for his anti-Zionism more than anything, and as many people have pointed out, that has nothing to do with the Jewish people. That is just about what many perceived to be an apartheid state, between Israel and Palestine. And this is the game. This is how they play it now. It's like if you are in opposition to the liberal world order or whatever they want to call it, then you are a hateful, bigoted, alt-right, white supremacist Nazi scumbag. So
I haven't looked.
I'm one of them too now.
I haven't looked at it, but I wonder how Southern Poverty Law Center covered Biden's meeting with MBS, and MBS basically, when Biden asks him about Khashoggi, MBS like throws it right back in his face, and he's like, I can't remember the name of the reporter, but basically the Palestinian reporter or Palestinian sympathetic reporter that was sniped by the Israelis. Like, I don't even know if they mentioned that. They probably never wouldn't even touch that,
No, I mean, this is I've kind of stopped playing the game of like, oh, you're a hypocrite, because they're not going to apply these same rules to Biden and his meandering thoughts. He's a fucking idiot, lunatic, and a scumbag. And it's like they're not going to apply any of that to these guys, but they're going to apply it to random sub 10,000 YouTube subscribed accounts like myself. I mean, it's ridiculous. Not the most powerful man in the world. No. A guy who has been on Timcast once.
Get him.
Yeah. So dumb.
All right. So let's start this off. So I am like an economic nerd.
Yeah.
Jocelyn is not.
I don't want to even put money in banks. I'm like, let's just keep dollars, put them in a piggy bank, bury them in the yard.
So
Scary times.
So we'll walk through this.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm gonna learn.
You
I'm
ask
just gonna
questions.
sit and
If
learn.
something we say doesn't make sense, ask questions or
Yeah.
something like that. Okay. All right.
That'll be perfect, actually. Yeah.
I want to kick this off by putting you in the time machine. All right. It's 2007. All right. Paris Hilton is still a thing. Okay. Flip phones are still a thing. Okay. And it's a like in most people's mind, it's the freshest bad economic period that they can draw a parallel to. Because if you try and talk to especially millennials and Gen Zers now about the Depression, they just can't even, they have no conceptualization of it, right? Like, I mean, we don't have any conceptualization of it because we didn't live through it, right? 07, 08, I think is probably the one thing that you could really kind of like transport people back to. Even talking about the inflation crisis in the 70s that led up to the 80s is also something that's really foreign to younger folks. Whereas if you're a boomer, I'm like, you somewhat remember that time period and kind of the chaos that happened. But
they remember it well, for sure.
Yeah, that's not somewhat.
Yeah. Well,
like, wait, I'm doing the math in my head.
For them, it's the exact same as 08, 09 was for me. I mean, it was that same age range. So
yeah. But I'm watching the financial decisions that are being made, and I'm like, even if they can take themselves back to that time period, they obviously didn't learn anything, right? Like, but you were in the housing and the mortgage market way back when. Did you work through 07, 08? What was that like?
I came into the mortgage field in 08, 09, so right in the teeth of the actual recession. I had actually started working for my family's business in 07, but it was part-time because I was still finishing college. So I got to see kind of the last gasp of the good time, and then I really came in full-time for the teeth of the decline. I mean, it was horrific, man. It was absolutely horrific, and you know, anybody that owned a house during that period will be the first to tell you. I mean, the vast majority of housing was cut in half in most of the areas of California that I was working in. It was temporary, obviously. It recovered because of Fed intervention, but it was at the time catastrophic because the vast majority of people were buying houses on no money down or very little down. Many of them lied about their income because there was no underwriting stipulations that required that they prove out their capacity to repay or to sustain the payments monthly, even much less repay it ultimately. So it was all a house of cards, and this is why, you know, people like myself and Ron Paul and others that were privy to the shenanigans were warning about it. And I think I even understood it in I wouldn't say a deeper way, but a different way from Ron Paul. You know, he was analyzing it based off of policy at the federal level and just realizing that that was going to create a bunch of unintended consequences that would ultimately create a bubble in real estate. And I was analyzing it based off of my understanding of both that as well as the underwriting policies that I was witnessing in the mortgage field. So I knew that it was all garbage. So yeah, it was.
Yeah,
it sure was.
No, I was a prop trader at the time, and so a lot of
what's prop trader? I don't know.
Like
I know
proprietary trader. So you front a little bit of your own money, but then the house leverages you up, and you trade for your own account, right? So a lot of the guys I was in the office with during that time period, we'd check in the morning. You know, we'd do our research and stuff like that. But pretty much every morning for like 4 or 5 months, all we do is at the opening bell, short Countrywide, short Washington Mutual, short Wachovia,
Lennar.
Like all the home builders, right? Like you would just short anything that had to do anything with housing, right? All the title insurance companies. And then at the end of the day, typically you were up because just everything was just getting destroyed. There was no bid on so many of these securities and these markets. But I think something that a lot of people might discount or they might choose to like not even think about is I don't think we ever paid our pound of flesh in 07, 08. As bad as it was, and as much asset destruction happened, the Fed stepping in effectively truncated the clearing out of all of that dead wood. And yeah, there were some bankruptcies and things like that. But I mean, shit, some of these large investment banks, they basically labeled them too big to fail. And they essentially just kind of like warehoused all this shit that they were selling that was worthless on the Fed's books and subsidized it via the taxpayer.
Right. Exactly.
Like, do you think there's weight to that? Or do you think we did kind of like clear out at least some of the garbage?
Oh no, we cleared out a lot of it actually. In the housing market in particular, we cleared out a lot of it. But what we didn't clear out was the financial uh, mechanisms and new derivatives contracts and things like that. That's what we didn't clear out. And had we allowed everything to collapse as it should have, then they would the money managers, the banks, the hedge funds of the world would have realized that okay, these investment creations are very perilous, and they probably would have slowed down with them. Unfortunately, because the only people that really paid the price were the homeowners and then some of the smaller banks, which they allowed to go bankrupt. But the big banks and the biggest money managers all were bailed out. The derivatives contracts exploded from there, and they have not looked back since. So I think that's the real price we paid. It's like we did clear out the vast majority of very weak home owners and borrowers, but we didn't clear out the worst actors in the lending realm, and that was catastrophic. And we're now paying that price to this day.
Yeah. So, all right. So let's go from. Do you have questions about that? Like you get most of that.
It in. I think I get it.
Okay. All right. So
okay, good.
Yeah. So the next stop on the train. I know everyone wants to get to 2020, but we have to stop at 2018 first, right? 2018, after we basically have this historic bull run in stocks, the Federal Reserve tries to take the punch bowl away just a little bit. And then the overnight repo market just explodes.
What's a repo market?
Okay. So, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Clint. So the repo market is essentially a clearinghouse where all the big banks, at the end of the day, they have to make all the columns line up. Yeah. And so some of the banks at the end of the day, based off all the transactions, they have some cash left over. Some of them have like a cash deficit. And so they all have to kind of like even that out. And so it's basically a market that they can all go to and lend to each other if they have extra cash at a very low overnight interest rate to the other banks that need cash in order for them to all kind of square up. And actually, when Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns fell was the last time that the repo market froze up because no one wanted any counterparty risk. They didn't think they would be able to get their money back. So like if you were Morgan Stanley and you had, $50 million and Wachovia said, hey, we need 50 million overnight in order to like rectify our books. Right. You were like, yeah, I'm not going to give that to you because I know I might not get it back. Right. You might be illiquid. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a pretty good explanation. I mean, you have to include the Federal Reserve in that equation because ultimately they're the lender of last resort. So if the banks themselves aren't able to balance their books, that's where you see the reverse repos, which is basically the Fed intervening to make sure that those accounts balance for all of the banks. So there was some, I mean, it wasn't reported at the time, but it was enormous sums that were pumped into the system, or not really printed, but just kind of like digitally added to the system to keep it from imploding. I don't actually understand the underlying reasons why there was such issues in that market during that time. Matt, are you privy? I would love to know if you know it.
Yeah. So the overnight lending mechanism is very much based off of like it's a very complex equation that they have to rectify at the end of the day, right? Because you have all these instruments that get executed during the day, or you have money that goes out the door that might go out in portions or in large pieces, right? And so, interestingly enough, we're coming into something similar right now. You would think that all the banks flush with cash wouldn't necessarily have a problem with the overnight repo market because just everyone has oodles of cash sitting around. The question is whether or not it's actually accessible, right? And so they went through all these stress tests and everything like that. And so they instituted requirements where you have to have certain assets on the book, and it might not necessarily be cash. So like if you have certain liabilities as a bank, you can't necessarily just keep cash. Like you also have to have like treasuries or something like that in order to offset it so that you have something of value that kind of like balances, right? And that equation,
it was an allocation issue more than it was a
exactly
actual
like
solvency issue.
the stopgaps or the protections that they put in place essentially froze up the market because there just wasn't enough liquid capital in the repo market in order to make things line up at the end of the day. Right.
Okay. Well, then that's not as bad as it being an actual solvency issue. That makes me feel better, I guess.
Well, it does and it doesn't though, because it really freaked them out. Because if you remember, like they had easy money policy for like 10 years. We've been on an easy money policy leading up to that.
Yeah.
The moment they started to just take away, like, it's like having a gigantic bowl of cocaine in front of you, and they took like a spoonful out of the bowl, and all of a sudden, all hell was about to break loose, right? So it was
because were they implementing QT at the time? Quantitative tightening?
They were just starting to talk about like unwinding the quantitative easing component of it, which also makes me wonder, and no one reports on this, like all of that shit that's on their books right now. They bought all those mortgage-backed securities that were basically worthless, right? That shit's still there, right? Like it didn't go anywhere. Like it didn't like they've since bought other mortgage-backed securities that maybe they have a higher street value than the stuff than they bought in 08. But all of that stuff it could be completely illiquid crap. Like there might, if they tried to do QT and put it out there on the market, especially at the same time that they're raising rates, there might be zero bidders, right? Because the actual value of the assets that they have on the book might be zero, even though they're showing
that's exactly what happened in 0809 is that I forget which bank it was. I think it was Washington Mutual that their book essentially had no bidders. So the Fed chair, I forget who it was at the time, or maybe it wasn't the Fed chair. It might have been Treasury Secretary. Yeah. Hank Paulson sits down with, I think it was Jamie Dimon of Chase, which is now JP Morgan Chase. And he says, if you buy this, I will allow this merger and blah, 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 like I'll underwrite it. And that's basically how they remedied things, was instead of letting the shit hit the fan like it should have, they underwrote and guaranteed a bunch of shit that, like, hey, if you buy this for above market value because there is no buyer for it right now, we will guarantee it for you. So I think that unfortunately that precedent has now emboldened everybody that survived that period to behave in a very terrible fashion, very, very reckless fashion.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, I think a lot of these Wall Street types, they just now assume that, like, if we make a mistake, right, like Big Daddy Jay Powell right now, or Treasury Secretary Yellen will step in and make sure to like make it all good, right?
And they have good reason to believe that.
And also think about it this way: we've been in a period of time with low interest rates, and those low interest rates incentivize risk-taking behavior, right? So we're no longer an economy of savers. We're no longer self-financing loans and things like that. All of the loans are just kind of ethereal, like they're just made up out of nowhere. Where it used to be, like in the 80s, after Volcker increases interest rates, people could get a CD or a savings account that actually paid them a decent return on their cash. And then that money,
not decent, great.
Well, yeah, I mean, shit. Like people used to. I worked at a bank for a large. When I was at the bank, we first met when I was working at the bank, and people will come in all the time, and our CD rates would be like 2%, 3%, 4%. They'd be like, "Man, I remember 10 years ago when I could get a CD that yielded like 9-10%," and I was like, "Yeah, good luck with that."
Look at the bond. Are those? I don't honestly, like, I don't even know CDs from bond. I don't even know. But I was
a
just
CD
thinking,
is a certified deposit. It's just basically a guaranteed return from the bank if you keep your money with them.
Oh, Well, I was thinking when my parents died, we found these Series E bonds or I bonds or something.
Yeah.
And I'm like, why don't they have this anymore? It was like, it literally almost tripled in size,
Yeah.
but then you have to keep their.
So those are basically you giving your money to the government, and then the government promises you a return.
Whereas a CD is a bank.
Yeah.
No, they do actually. They have I think they're called I bonds. They're inflation hedges, but you can only buy them up to $10,000 or $12,000 per individual, and they're hedges against the inflation rate. So there's still stuff out there, but it's just like $10,000 for a serious investor. That is not nearly enough to hedge against inflation.
Yeah. Any of those things that are kind of like inflation connected are typically limited because that also becomes a systemic risk, right? So like if inflation runs hot for a long period of time, the US government just paying out like, and the other thing is tips, like short-term inflation protected securities, the government could run out of money like overnight because if inflation runs wild, they would just be paying all of that shit, right?
Okay.
But so yeah,
they wouldn't run out. They would just print it, but I get
your
point.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So and we'll get to that because we definitely have to play a game of like, you know, what's going to happen here, right? Like kind of prognostication. So 2018, that really Powell got shook when that happened. And so he immediately put everything back into effect. And now we get to 2020, right? 2020, COVID hits, but what was your assessment of the market just before COVID hit? Did you think everything was hunky-dory or were you seeing canaries in the coal mine?
No, I mean, the market is in a perpetual bubble. It's almost entirely dependent on Fed policy, though. So, like, I knew that as long as they were to keep rates hyper low, that we could probably keep this game going.
Yeah.
But I knew that also eventually, if you keep the rates low long enough and you incentivize borrowing and spending and investing based off of borrowed capital, at hyper low rates, you're going to be forcing more and more people to chase yield, which is a misallocation of capital generally, unless you're very, very bright. It's you're investing in the top of a market, you know, trying to make gains that are bigger than your 3% that you borrowed the money at or something like that. And as that compresses, you're borrowing for so little, but you're also just barely scraping out a yield above that. It gets very dangerous. And I think that's the period that we were in pre-2020, where it was already very tight. It was very challenging for pensions, for instance, to make the necessary return on their investments, to pay off their pensioners, the people that rely on that for, you know, retirement income, things of that nature. So I knew that it was, you know, we were in an end stage of a bubble anyways, but it was like, then the lockdowns happen and everything gets disjointed. So I'm sure we'll go into that, but that was my analysis at the time.
No, that's a huge lead in because that was my perspective as well. Was we should have hit a recession in 2020. It was coming, right? And it was just,
you're saying even without the lockdowns, we should have hit a recession.
100%. Yeah, right. Because they were getting to the point where, like, think about yourself, like, put yourself in not that you would want to, but put yourself in Jerome Powell's shoes, right? You've got 10 years of basically zero interest rate.
Yep.
That is the scariest position as a central banker to be in because you have no ammunition if shit hits the skids, right? You have absolutely no way to cut interest rates to then revive the economy if things start to head south.
And well, they have additional mechanisms. QE, he could still juice the
interest
system,
rate pegging.
But the real problem that they have is if inflation strikes, then they have no real tools other than to hike rates. And because of the national debt, which he has to pay attention to some extent too, hiking interest rates significantly is basically politically unpalatable. So yes, you're absolutely right. He was in a jam.
Oh yeah. And when you add in what happened in 2018, I think he was afraid. Like, I think there's a lot of fear that's driving Fed policy decision right now. It has nothing to do with proactive, like being a good steward of whatever they're tasked with. I mean, I know they say that they're tasked with, you know, stable money and stable markets, and then secondarily unemployment or employment. But I think their decision making right now is very much fear-based. It has, I mean, like, you can just tell they're not being proactive.
But you don't think that someone has their voice in his ear or anything like that?
Well, so that's a good question. So from your standpoint, Clint, do you think that Powell has some level of autonomy? I know they tell us he's supposed to have some level of autonomy, but obviously meets with Biden. He probably, like, fucking Jamie Dimon and the CEO of Goldman probably have him on speed dial. Like,
oh yeah.
do you think he's
And
taking his marching orders from somewhere else?
So do the the heads of the Bank of Japan and the Bank of the IMF, the English banks, like everybody has a finger on the lever of the Fed policy. So do I think he has some autonomy? Yes, I think he has some.
Yeah.
But do I think he has full autonomy? Not a fucking chance. Like, no way.
Yeah.
he would be assassinated if that were the case, because I'm dead serious, because his decision making has so much power, and we're talking trillions and like maybe a quadrillion dollars that he is ultimately able to manipulate because of his position. There's just no fucking way he's the only guy that gets to make that call. Not a chance.
Yeah. It's almost funny too, because they make this big show about the FOMC meetings and how there's all these governors that basically meet. Like, you have the Fed governors from around the country, and then you have like non-voting members and all this other stuff. But ultimately, there's only one vote, right? It's not decision by committee. Like, they give their input or whatever, but at the end of the day, Jerome Powell gets veto power over everything.
Was he voted in?
No, he's appointed and then
by the
confirmed by the Senate. Well, he was just appointed for a second term and confirmed by the Senate. So Biden appoints him, which this was an interesting.
How does the president appoint like the person who's running?
It's a fucking racket. That's why.
No, that doesn't seem correct.
So this was an interesting point that someone brought up, and I can't remember where they brought it up. They might have even brought it up on Fox. Every so often they have a bright idea. It's once in a while. But they talked about how Biden's opportunity politically to distance himself from the inevitable, from what I think you think and what I think is coming, would have been to cut Powell loose and bring in a different Fed chair to then say, the typical political bullshit. We could just put it on the last guy, right? Like, he fucked up. I got the new guy in place. We're going to have to, clean things up. But I thought it was an interesting point, because why renominate the guy that now everyone's telling you essentially allowed inflation to run wild and is now causing you pretty much all of his political problems? Like, he can talk about abortion and guns all he wants, but at the end of the day, inflation is what every single American family is thinking about.
Well, they may want to keep that same guy in there to take the fall when the shit hits the fan, and just say, well, he had 10 years to set this monetary policy and he fucked it up. It's not us. Yeah. But I mean, obviously the Republicans are going to turn around and say, well, you appointed him, so it's on you. And it's just going to become, hot potato as to who catches the blame.
Yeah.
I don't, this is my big question. Like, I don't know if the Fed's policy is to actually defend the dollar or to usher in a central bank digital currency.
Oh, that's what I say to him all the time. I said, this is what's going on. Central digital currency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To keep that money buried in the back.
So talk us through that. So what would be the thought process or the mechanism of instituting a central bank digital currency?
Well, the thought process would be it's a total panopticon, complete control of your populace. You get to decide who gets the money, how they spend it, everything. It's basically the worst possible thing if you value liberty whatsoever, because they can decide to implement UBI, where they force money into the system, which would be extraordinarily inflationary, because historically it has just been big swaths of money that they give to big businesses or big banks, but it hasn't been at the consumer level. You give it to the consumer, it's instantly inflationary. That's exactly what we saw with even the $1,200 checks, as pathetic as they were during lockdowns. If you cut production, but you also give everybody $1,200 that they didn't have before, and they go out and they spend it, well, all of a sudden prices start to elevate. And I think that's basically what they could do with a CBDC, is implement UBI, and then if you want that
UBI?
money,
What's UBI?
Universal basic income.
Oh, okay, got it.
What Andrew Yang, that piece of shit, always talks about.
Yeah. Elon Musk talked about it too. He's like, the robots are going to take over, and so they'll have to have a universal income.
Dude, that guy's the biggest freaking grifter, man. Like, what's your opinion on
Yang or Musk?
No, Musk. I mean, like, Yang doesn't
Yang's
have
Yang's a bigger grifter. Come on.
You think so?
At least Musk does something. Yang doesn't do shit.
He has babies, apparently. A lot of them.
He's got 9 kids. He's doing shit. Come on.
He's trying to repopulate the earth just by himself. All right. So
I agree. Digital currency, universal income.
I can see them going.
But see, here's the thing, though, and just to make the point a little bit more specific, there are banking interests and a bunch of people that are involved in the central bank scheme across the globe that probably want to see fiat currency stabilized and survive. Because I think there are some old school families that are probably benefiting from that quasi monopoly or oligopoly that probably would rather not see it change. So there's competing interests that are recognizing that fiat is dying in many countries across the globe, and probably the final hammer to drop will be the US dollar. And they may be saying to themselves, well, we need to get in front of this. This is where the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset comes in, where they say, okay, fiat is dying. They've lost confidence in it. We need to implement CBDCs to replace fiat, but maintain our position of power in this oligopolist system.
Yeah.
So I think that's the real question, though, is Powell and are the Federal Reserve in the CBDC camp, or are they ultimately going to prove themselves to be in the defend the existing fiat standard, defend the dollar camp? And obviously, most libertarians believe that the dollar cannot be defended, so they're probably in the CBDC camp. I am still keeping, maybe a 20% window open that they are going to do what's necessary to defend the dollar, in which case we'll have a terrible depression. So I don't know which.
Yeah, I've had this conversation with a bunch of people now where I always ask them, like, do you think Powell is more like Volcker, or do you think he's more like, kind of like a Greenspan or a Bernanke type? I think the jury's still out.
Who knows?
Right? Like,
yeah, who knows?
A lot depends on, and this is also interesting. Like, think about it this way too. Powell comes across to me as like an old school guy. You got an old octogenarian in the White House, right? So like you have these kind of like old money interests that, and a lot of people don't see this, the internal power struggle that happens within politics. Everyone thinks that everyone's a monolith, right? So like a Democrat is a Democrat, a Republican is a Republican. It's bullshit. They have freaking fractures within them, and they're always trying to be, the crab that gets to the top of the pot, right? It almost seems like the old money interests are currently in control. The question is whether or not the political heat gets high enough where they can actually do something like effectively defend the dollar, right? I've got a lot of people telling me that they think that this leg down isn't going to be nearly as bad as the next one, because, I mean, just look at the 70s. Like if I pull up, this is like inflation over time, right? Shit.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I can freaking put this bigger, but so what you have
hit the 3 dots in the top right. 3 dots in the very top right of your actual browser. I think you should be able to zoom.
Let's see. Full screen layout. No, hold on.
Oh, up there on the browser up there.
Yep.
Or and you could just do Control Plus.
All right. I'm such a Luddite. Okay, here we go.
There you go.
Yeah, there we go. All right. So this is basically inflation over, say, the last 100 years or so, right? So these two spikes that happen right here, this is the 40s, right? After basically after the Great Depression or in the midst of the Great Depression, depending on how you define it. And then these spikes here are the 70s, right? And so this is essentially, so anyone who's not an economic historian, during the 70s, you had a big inflation spike. You had a Fed that decided that they were going to take money out of the market to try and quell inflation, but they stopped short of where they needed to. And then you get this second big spike afterward. And so a lot of people are trying to draw the parallel between the 70s and today, saying that what they think is going to happen is Powell is going to flinch you'll end up getting some kind of drop in inflation, but then the next inflationary pump is going to be the death spiral, because there's just a fuck ton of money either sitting on the sidelines or sloshing around. And if he doesn't do a decent enough job of actually pulling that money out of the market, that then the second swath of inflation will be a purely speculative swath, where now you're not just seeing equities go up, or or you're not seeing everything go up. You just see this high risk shit go up. So oil to the moon, food to the moon, like rent to the moon, and then everything else sucks, right? Because you're just basically dumping money into areas that people are forced to purchase, as opposed to right now where you still have asset bubbles and some consumer discretionary stuff, and things that people don't necessarily need to survive. Do you think that there's going to be this kind of like second coming, so to speak, of inflation?
It's again here. There's two inflations.
Well, no,
did they do the same thing?
Yeah, no, it took them
in the 40s?
It took them 2-3 times to figure out that this is the mechanism where if you don't effectively monitor, like M2 is the most important freaking chart to look at, the total amount of money that's in the market. That's what you need to watch. You can look at CPI all day long. It gets freaking manipulated, not to mention the fact that everyone says that if you use the 1980 methods for the CPI, we're not at 9%, we're at 20, right? Like we're at all-time highs in inflation. But yeah, they suffer the same mistakes over and over again. And I'm
assuming they're mistakes, but yeah.
Well, yeah, that's true.
I like you.
But so yeah, I think that's the thing that everyone's waiting to see is, are we going to get some kind of relief and then all of a sudden another pop, or is this the fall that actually fixes, air quotes, fixes the problem, the inflation problem?
Yeah, I've already my predictions are on the record for quite some time now that I think that we'll experience a whipsaw where you get inflation, and then you have this hiking interest rate cycle that will start to rattle the market so severely and start to rattle employment pretty significantly, to the point that the Fed reverses course, and then all of the trillions that they've pumped into the system over the past 2 years during COVID will flood back into the market, because the investors will think that risk is back on and that they should be playing the inflationary game again. And at that point, it'll probably be too hard for them to stop it. My personal prediction has been that what they're doing right now is buying themselves time to get the CBDC in place, so that when the dollar inevitably dies, they are ready to transition to it. I don't have enough proof to say like this definitively. It's just based off of my analysis of like what is inevitably going to happen. You have too much money you've pumped in the system. In order to remove it, you would have to do QT that would make your mother cry. I don't think that the political will exist. So they're going to hike rates temporarily, crush the market, crush employment very briefly, reverse course, and then the hyperinflationary period hits in earnest. So this is why I still am a believer in Bitcoin or whatever cryptocurrencies you prefer. I'm still a believer in gold and silver because ultimately I will be a believer in real estate once we see a correction in real estate from this hiking interest rate cycle, which I would imagine will probably be a good buying opportunity sometime in 2023, and then the shit hits the fan after that. That's my prediction.
For people like me, I know you try to explain this to me all the time, and I just can't. I ask him like every 3 days. When you say, this is just really basic question here, but when you say you have to raise interest rates to drop inflation, like really, what's the mechanism?
I'll put it as simply as possible. An interest rate is the price you pay for money. So if you're going to be an investor, say you want to buy a house and you borrow it at 10%, well, you're not going to be able to buy as much of a house, right? Because that's going to cost you more per month because of the interest rate you're paying. So that means that you're going to offer less to buy the home. So if you hike interest rates, it reduces the price of assets that are being acquired in that current economic system. So does that make sense?
Kind of.
So the higher the interest rate, the lower the purchase price. The lower the interest rate, the higher the purchase price. That's really
But
as
it
simple
doesn't
as
get the money out of the system, right? The money that was pumped in,
Well,
it doesn't get that out.
That's what the quantitative tightening does. It's where the Fed actually absorbs some of the capital that they've lent out to these banks. But there's also a deflationary effect because you have the assets themselves become worth less, not worthless, but worth less, and that makes the the economy have less liquidity in it because if your stock price has gone from $500 a share to 250 and you have all the whole Fortune 500 has had that means that money is gone. It's basically been absorbed from the system, or removed from the system in the form of losses. So that is, instead of the banks eating it, they allow the investors to eat it. I mean, the banks are oftentimes investors, so this gets really convoluted, but I hope that makes sense.
That makes sense.
You also have the rollover of debt too. So if you're going to carry debt, right, and you then have to roll it over at a higher interest rate,
right?
It also has
which many corporations borrow on a 1, 2, and 5 year duration. So if their debt is due 2 years from now, and then say the 2-year period comes up while we're in this elevated interest rate cycle, well, then it's much more expensive for them to pay that debt, which means that they have to remove capital from employment, R&D, all sorts of other aspects of their business enterprise. So that is also deflationary in effect. So hiking interest rates creates a deflationary cascade in many, many ways.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question about obviously
before Gene Epstein rips me an asshole. I mean price deflationary.
Yes.
By an Austrian vantage point, the only inflation and deflation occurs when you either create or destroy money itself.
Yeah.
Like that's how they view it. I speak in more of an investor's lexicon. Like it's deflation. Like if I could buy a house for $200,000 and it was worth $500,000 2 years ago, well, then that's a deflationary period because my dollar is going further. So I speak in price deflationary terms or price inflationary terms. So this is not so much for you, Jocelyn, as much as to make sure that the Austrians don't fucking tear me apart.
One of the dudes I watch religiously, I don't know if you've caught his channel. Guy goes by the name of the Maverick of Wall Street. Every single episode, at least twice, he plays the sound bit where he's like, inflation is always a monetary phenomenon, right? And it's specifically targeted at the current time period where everyone on the entire, especially in the political spectrum, as they run for lifeboats, they're trying to get you to think that inflation has to do with Putin or supply chain issues and stuff like that. And those things might have exacerbated the problem. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the core problem or the core source of inflation in this marketplace is the monetary policy, easy monetary policy, low interest rates, and the printing of money. And it's, what's also interesting is the thought that, so like we're all in the Fed types, right? And the thought that like, okay, so what comes next, right? Like if you did end the Fed, if you could snap your fingers today and just like freaking shut them down, right? I almost like want to play a devil's advocate and be like, would that just mean that the CBDC people would win faster, right? Like that's the one thing that I owe it. Like it makes me think about that quite often to wonder whether or not that's something that it's like when you fire your head coach, right? Like, yeah, but who are you going to hire? Right? Like what comes next?
I mean, if you're a consumer, if you're like us, you would almost certainly shift to gold, silver, and Bitcoin. But I mean, if you're ending the central bank, the Fed, you would imagine that there would be no mechanism to implement a CBDC because a central bank digital currency is undoubtedly going to be managed by a central bank. Or the Federal Reserve.
There have been, I don't know if these were just kind of like just misdirection or things like that, but there have been warning shots fired by, say, like Janet Yellen, talking about, if the Fed fails, what they could do is just ingest the Fed into the U.S. Treasury, right?
I don't even see what difference that makes. It's like, to me, it's all kind of the same thing anyways, but maybe
it would put it even closer to the political process, right? Like now there's not even an illusion of impartiality, right? Now it's just
I'd almost prefer that. I'd almost prefer that people know that this is a political apparatus that's controlling the value of your savings and the value of your currency. Like, fuck this shell game where they have everybody thinking, oh, it's some independent bank that's making these decisions. Like, I would almost rather it be like, okay, yeah, this is a complete scam con game to rip off every man, woman, and child of their hard-earned savings from time immemorial all the way into the future until we have a fucking Great Depression globally. Like, I hate the fact that people are able to say, well, the central bank, the Federal Reserve is a private bank. It's like, yeah, I guess, it's like,
yeah, right.
Well, if the guy is elected by the president and not voted in, I feel like that's.
I'm also super
fucked up.
I'm also super
I
interested.
agree.
So I bet it doesn't apply, but the SCOTUS ruling that just came out about the EPA not being able to like make law based off of appointed, like, what if someone actually tried to connect those dots with the Fed, right?
I wish, man.
Like, you can't make laws if you're not appointed by the people?
Well, no. Well, yeah, you have to be an elected person and actually vote for laws, whereas like the elected people can't defer their authority.
They delegated to the EPA to be able to actually write regulations, and that's what SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, came out and said, no, can't do that.
Yeah,
I like this SCOTUS.
Well,
yeah, me too.
Now you do
right
now. But yeah, so all right, so let me kind of like pivot a little bit and ask you how ESG works into this, because I know you've been big on ESG. Essentially, like a very kind of like basic idea. What is ESG, and how do you think it kind of like factors into this overall, economic manipulation that's happening?
It's complicated. Well, ESG is environmental, social, and governance. It's basically a new accounting paradigm where they get to create a corporate credit score as opposed to a social credit score. So while libertarians, the Alex Jones of the world, were all concerned about a social credit score, they created ESG to implement kind of a woke ideology, a Marxist takeover of the corporate world, literally the world over.
Yep.
So
dealing with environment kind of thing.
Yep.
And environmentalism, but also social justice, and then also governance, including like the racial makeup of your board, things like that.
That's what we were. Not this has anything to do with what we're talking about, but we were just listening to, what's her name? Shiva.
Yeah.
Randana Shiva.
Yeah.
And she was talking about how, like, in India, they forced the farmers to use fertilizer, and then they said, this fertilizer is killing the environment, so we're taking your land. like we'll just put these out there, they're going to kill everything, and then we're going to blame you for what you did.
They did a similar thing in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is now bankrupt because of it. They're also doing a similar thing in the Netherlands right now, which is why we're seeing those protests from the farmers. I mean, this is all ESG. So I think that it doesn't necessarily play into central bank policy, or at least it doesn't yet. It will soon, because what they're trying to implement now is a social justice, aka an ESG criteria within Fed policy. This is actually something that's happening in Congress right now, where they're trying, I shit you not. So if that happens, then, forget it. I mean, we're fucked at that point.
No, I mean, they were Yellen, and I think at one point Powell was talking about like an implied mandate of equality and equity, right? Like he was almost trying to build it into the inflation conversation. So like the idea that price stability was also an avenue for equity and equality for, disenfranchised peoples within the community, which is really scary, because that goes way, way, way down a rabbit hole of so the Fed's tools are not targeted, right? Like the Fed's tools are wide sweeping. So like if you have an inflationary bubble like in 07-08, where it was mostly housing that was driving up the inflationary bubble, their tools hurts everything. Okay. Now we have an inflationary bubble that is literally everything, right? But so when they implement those tools, they're essentially causing max pain across the entire economy. And typically it has ripple effects into the rest of the world. As soon as you start to weaponize that and use that as a means for,
woke shit,
equity, equality, and all this other stuff, it gets really fucking scary, because, you're now talking about like, someone who could be like, white people have too much money, increase interest rates or whatever. Like, you could
Well,
talk
flip,
about some really sinister shit.
yeah, flip it and imagine this. Unemployment is at 3%, but black unemployment's at 5%.
Mm.
You know, and like even though historically those are both really good numbers,
Yeah.
it would be that would allow them to say, well, forget this 3% figure. We're focused on making sure that black people are at maximal employment. So
Yeah.
now we're going to keep interest rates. We're going to go negative interest rates, for instance, which is something America has never done, but other central banks have been doing over the past decade. This would enable them to basically ignore the prior protocols by which they allegedly established monetary policy. Very, very fucking dangerous and something that we flatly cannot allow to happen. I mean, unless you're a collapsitarian, in which case bring it on, because it'll absolutely collapse everything.
Yeah, no shit. That is one of those things that I waver between. Like, I consider myself like more on the agorist spectrum. I've spent a lot of time with
I'm
my
just on the spectrum.
Yeah, most of us are on the spectrum. Actually,
neurodivergent.
We were just talking to make a
it.
left turn quite literally in this conversation. We were just talking about earlier about you came up in the therapy world, right?
Right, I'm a therapist, but I'm not practicing.
And therapists have always lived in this world of this just amazing freaking acrobatics with terms and definitions and stuff like that. And this idea of neurodivergence.
Well, this was not when I was in school. This was not.
What's the other one?
This is how old I am.
Yeah.
Neurotypical.
Yes, yeah. But, and I was like, my typical like un-PC self. I was like, why don't they just call it not retarded? Like, why? Like, wait, doesn't that get the job done?
They talk about stims.
Yeah,
like, I can't stimming. I can't. Well, I'm so old that when I went to school, the big talk was everyone has prejudice.
Yeah.
Like we didn't talk about racism. It was everyone had prejudice like that. It was a much kinder conversation than it is now.
Yeah.
But
yeah, that's a whole different rabbit hole that we can go down.
I don't know where
well, I mean, that ties into the ESG stuff though. I mean, so it's very complicated, but the mechanism for the complete Marxist takeover of civilization globally starts with ESG on the corporate level. Then you have DEI on the collegiate and like hiring level, which it's to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is basically modifying your hiring practices to try and make sure that you have a diverse enough workforce and and then on the school level, there's on like the elementary school level, it's SEL, which is social emotional learning. But all three of these evil fucking acronyms, very few people understand, and they have been getting rolled out over the past 15 years. And it is exactly why when you combine all three, it's exactly why our culture has become so insanely woke so rapidly.
But we're gonna blow your minds with 2027 before you leave.
Oh my god.
All right, lay it on me. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. I can tell you from like I've been in the insurance space for over 12 years now. The DEI like invaded the insured space. It became like commonplace, right? And they use that as an avenue to get to the ESG, right? Yeah. So it's like
what year did DEI come in?
Yeah, so probably maybe 4 years ago, it really started to like, and the way it became really noticeable was all of these people that were like in the HR departments, all of a sudden they started branching out and becoming these consultants, these DEI consultants that would then come in and, consult on policies and hiring practices and give talks and things like that. And it's really messed up too, because like a lot of these people I was very close to, and like they themselves don't even know what they're doing, because there are very productive conversations you can have about having a diverse workforce, right? Like it's documented, like diverse workforces are more productive, assuming you have the culture to support it, right? If you have a shitty culture,
and also assuming
diversity hire, it's worse,
Well, and also assuming you're hiring actually talented people of diverse backgrounds. You can't just say, oh, well, I have this diverse group of gangsters that are now running Goldman Sachs. You'd be like, well, I'm fucked.
Well, no, and we had that conversation too. Like they would be called into like a Goldman Sachs type organization in the insurance industry, and they'd do this talk about hiring practices and that kind of thing. And there's always someone on the board who's basically in these old white man institutions is like the token hire. They're the token hire, right? They would bring in the DEI consultant to give a talk or whatever, and then to be like, okay, we checked that box, and they'd move on. Like I almost found that more palatable than the other institutions or the other organizations that went full the other end, where it became like all these employee resource groups. And like some of my friends were telling me about how like some of the people in the department would just sign up for all of these different groups so that they would never have to work, because every single one of them has a meeting, right? So you just go to a meeting, you get free lunch. In the afternoon, you go to a free meeting. It's like it's like an office space where it's like, to tell you the truth, probably only work about 15 minutes out of every single day. Like,
well, in the same frame from going to school as a therapist, and if you want to get, and this is the whole license, we've talked about licensure. I don't really believe in licensure, and
you're preaching to the choir.
And the licensure, it used to be when you first got in, right? It was like, you had to do your every year you had to do your credits or whatever, you move towards it. And it used to be fun. I'm an arts therapist, so it used to be a bunch of women dancing and a girl. It used to be fun, and then somewhere within a few years of me like getting out of school, it became these like sit down, you have to know exactly what's racism and what's and white privilege, and you have to sit there and say what your white privilege. I mean, it's crazy. And in order to keep your license, you have to do that.
You invited the vampire in with the nice comfortable talk about how you have biases, and then all of a sudden it became, oh, you're white and straight, you're a piece of shit, and you have to say that in front of the entire office building before we start, before this meeting ends. It's like, we really let the devil in. Like we let the
for Dracula. Real. And you have to like be there, and like you have to admit your stuff. Like, I mean, it's such a strain. And in the therapy world is so super liberal. Like I can't even.
Yeah. But just kind of like detailing the blueprint that you laid out, it definitely seems like DEI, and there were probably other predecessors too that came before it. It just is this natural progression where they kind of, they implement the first thing that seems mild and innocuous, and then it just gets steadily ramped up and ramped up and ramped up.
At least in that world,
But
that's why DEI has taken such a stranglehold over corporate America, is because ESG, your score is largely dependent on how good your DEI is. How hardcore your HR representative is about hiring a diverse background of people, and are you paying everybody equally? Are you inclusive? Do you allow sexual assault or harassment to be reported, and do you fire people? Like, so obviously some of this it sounds reasonable because you're like, well, I don't want to have a workplace where people are getting sexually harassed, but you create this culture of like, you can elevate yourself from being a perpetual victim. And if you're in a competitive workplace where you're trying to innovate and create and produce, but the way you elevate your employees is based off of how many grievances they have, and how many bosses they've gotten fired. Well, it's only a matter of time before China is fucking eating your lunch.
Yeah.
And, and that's what we're seeing.
I feel like I think I'm understanding the whole ESG thing.
Great.
That was kills me is like, I mean, well, first of all, for corporations to just the whole thing is a little crazy. But then to think that might be like put on a corporation, but that same corporation is doing all their work in China or in another country, or and they're not, and it just seems so convoluted in so many ways. Like there's so many. Just how can it be pure in any way, shape, or form? I don't know. If that's the way to say it.
It's not pure. It's really just
some fucking made up shit.
It is. It's totally made up shit, but it's also about subduing the populist left, because they were very upset with the banks after 0809, and they were trying to basically nationalize banks. That's like what many in Occupy Wall Street wanted to see done. They wanted a full socialist economic model, and the banks, sensing that, concocted ESG along with the United Nations to basically get them off their back. And that's what they successfully did.
I mean, that's what politics does. They take away everything that's important and they focus on things like, forcing the abortion issues or forcing the, they take all of
but you always have to remember that that's the diversion, right? Like that's
that's like
that's
what's
the
happening
circus,
in the corporate level,
the,
right?
the circus is there to not show you the rot, right? Like the real rot is what's happening economically. Hands down.
The social fights are usually secondary to the money fights, because the money fights is what people really care about. So when it comes to infiltration of corporate America or the corporate world, globally, that's the real shit, because that's where the money's at. And when they feed you, when they feed the conservatives a minor victory when it comes to overturning Roe versus Wade, I always view it as such. I go, okay, well, they're going to feel like they now have a voice, so hopefully they won't revolt against this incredibly corrupt system that's robbing them blind and inflating away their savings and, making it impossible for them to retire, because now it'll be harder for, their neighbor to abort their kid. It's like, I guess,
it's even more insidious than that, because there's a huge fundraising boom that happens afterward, right? And they have no intention of fixing what they riled you up over, right? And so you essentially gave your money to someone who's now going to go to DC or stay in DC, more importantly. They're not going to fix that. And then they're going to further push this train down the tracks for ESG and this fucking WEF globalist shit that then makes your life even worse, right? Like, who's it? The Canadian reporter, is it Laura or Lauren Chen? She had one of the best quotes I've ever seen in my entire life. She said, "I refuse to continue to fund my own oppression." Because that's exactly what this is. It's like, it's a way of being like, hey, look over here. We're going to fight for you. Now give us money, power, influence. And then what we're really doing is freaking backdooring you over here with all this other sinister shit.
Well, I mean, perfect example is like the Roe overturn that's a Supreme Court decision. Like, I'm not even saying that it's a concocted decision. I think that the Supreme Court heard it and they ruled how they, felt based off of their political ideology. But if you look at what Republicans in power versus the Democrats in power, and I'm not saying on the Supreme Court level, I'm saying, people that actually get to write laws. Like the Democrats, they could have fucking, made Roe the law of the land had they wanted to at any point that they controlled, the presidency, the House, and the Senate. They never did it. They never did it because they love having that political football to constantly fearmonger the left about, well, you have to vote for a Democrat president, even if his brain is literally leaking out of his ear, because and
he's reading from note cards.
Yes.
Repeat line.
This is where you sit, dumb bitch. Like, this is where you sit. Yeah. They have to keep that political football up in the air so that they can say, you have to vote for this dude, even though he put God knows how many millions of black people behind bars and he's a total fucking piece of garbage because he gets to appoint a Supreme Court justice, maybe two, and that might protect your right to abortion. I mean, it's just so transparent when you actually step back from it all and go, like, these people don't actually do anything. The legislators don't do fucking anything for us. Nothing. Then I shit on the left. Let me say, conservatives are horrific. They've had, times when they had full power. They never fucking balance budgets. They never do anything that they claim to represent. They don't do they don't really rein in monetary policy or spending or anything else. It's just they're all fucking fraudulent scumbags, and they are both working in tandem to ultimately implement, things that anybody that values liberty should be completely opposed to.
Can I ask you just a random question?
Sure.
So we talk about this. Do you think there's going to be another pandemic, like another moment where they lock down? Matt thinks it's going to be.
I think it's going to be
like
economic.
out of no, but you think it's going to be economics that cause that to come in.
Yeah.
Do you think there's going to be something?
I think the first lockdown was economic.
Yeah, it could have been.
I think the first lockdown was to give them cover to print all this fucking money, is what I think it was.
It could have been. I mean, it's kind of like the Roe thing. It's like I said, it's a distraction, but it doesn't mean that it was created as a distraction. It's just utilized as one. And I think that COVID could be a similar thing. I forget. Do you put this on YouTube?
It's all good,
dude.
Okay.
If I get kicked off, I'll wear it as a badge of honor. Go for it.
Okay. I mean, I think that the creation of COVID and the funding of gain of function research, it's like that to me, and the fact that they covered it up,
Yeah.
that gives me enough doubt as to, was this unleashed on the earth intentionally, and
Oh,
was
yeah,
it done? Was it
definitely.
done to allow them to, as Matt just said, print and borrow all this money to bail out their friends, while also crushing consumer demand temporarily to prevent the inflationary period that would have occurred instantaneously had you, not. So I don't know. It's all very, you get real Alex Jonesy if you start going down that path.
Oh,
But
yeah.
I'm sorry, what was your question?
Well, no, but also it's interesting that, people were saying like the vaccine passport things were kind of beginning runs for that digital currency. I mean, it was connected, in a lot of conspiracy minds, that all of that work was kind of beginning the process
Well,
to
it
make way
did.
for.
It did begin that process,
Yeah.
whether or not that was the intention of the release, or
I mean, it may be
I don't know.
connected. Who knows?
Well,
Yeah,
no,
I think so.
there's a couple of countries now where, like, whereas it was somewhat rebuffed in the U.S., I mean, you see it in Canada right now, right? You saw it to the fullest extent in China, right? You've seen a couple of the stories about the bank runs in China and how they stopped a number of the organizers of the protests out in front of the banks from being able to travel because they just clicked off their travel status on their passport.
Yeah, they said that they were COVID positive, and they're like, "All right, well, we're going to arrest you if you don't get out of line for this bank." It's like, oh, I wonder why.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
And then, by the way, that bank went bankrupt last week. I don't know if you're
Yes.
aware of that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And this is the other thing is China has such a. I mean, like, obviously, you don't get full information from them because everything is controlled, as if it's not controlled here in the U.S. as far as when it's leaked. But it's the economic situation in China also it's sent me down a rabbit hole wondering whether or not
He didn't sleep for like 24 hours.
whether or not the COVID
I like it.
release,
I like it. I do that shit too.
Whether or not the COVID release was a targeted economic attack on China to try and stave off almost like the inevitable, right? Like, China is on our heels, and then the question being whether or not it was something that was essentially like a biometric nuclear bomb that they set off. And it's ironic that they set off something that has such a low death rate, but it's like, it's almost like it was planned because to target China specifically, or at least that part of the world. And I guess maybe they just assumed that there was going to be blowback, and then they would end up getting that, here. And then they figured, all right, well, how do we turn lemons into lemonade? Oh, we'll just lock everyone down and stave off the recession or
Get
the
rid of
depression
all the
for
old
2 years.
people so they don't have to pay their social security.
Well, yeah.
Like, I mean, come
Right.
on.
No, that was my thought early on when I first realized that it was so lethal to the elderly and infirmed population. I was like, well, they
Listen,
can't
it's not-
afford all the
it's
unfunded
not that
liabilities
it's-
of Social Security and Medicaid, and yeah.
Yeah, it's not that COVID is so bad. It's they kill them in the hospitals. It's just the plain old truth.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's certainly part of it, but also the elderly, if you're north of 80 and you have, diabetes and shit like that, like, COVID is
Yeah.
definitely enough to kill you. It is.
Yeah.
I mean, it does, but yeah.
Yeah. No, it's
the treatments in the hospital, like refusing respiratory therapy or, those other things.
so a lot
then they refuse the ivermectin or whatever else.
Yeah,
that might have
and then they
actually
give
saved
you
them,
5 rounds of remdesivir in 24 hours.
Yeah.
That'll
which is
kill you.
definitely enough to kill you. Yeah.
which causes the same shit that they tell you that they're trying to prevent.
Right.
So where I come at it from, a lot of this stuff, a lot of times it boils down to economics. A lot of times I'm more than often tracing money or capital flows versus actually tracing who shook hands with who and all the kind of like interpersonal stuff, right? So do you want to introduce the idea of 2027? So
wait a minute, hold on. You didn't get his opinion on where the market's going?
Oh,
you should do that before you hit 2027.
So
you did say the word depression.
I think you've talked about the whipsaw. I think Michael Burry, if you pay attention to Michael Burry, talked about the bullwhip effect and the fact that the amplitude of the bullwhip is increasing over time. I think that's something you're on board with, right? You think we're in a fall. What'll happen is we'll have another inflationary rise, and that'll probably be the bubble pop, the big one, right?
I mean, or it could be a double whipsaw where they
Yeah.
do it twice and then it dies. I'm not sure how many times it'll take, but I think we're very, very close to the end of both the U.S. dollars, reserve currency status, as well as the sustainability of almost any fiat currency across the globe. Like
Yeah.
they're all dying. The whole reason that you're seeing, full on revolutions in some countries and major protests in others is because all of this stuff has hit basically at the same time. Like ESG, monetary manipulation, the printing, the increasing of interest rates, which is now creating, recessionary pressures or depressionary pressures. All of it combined simultaneously, on top of the fact that they've fomented such social discord amongst like people based off of race relations or their sexuality. Like all of this is it's just a perfect storm, man. I'm very, very concerned about how it plays out, because even though I think it's inevitable and I would like to get a better foundation economically where we're functioning off of a more Austrian worldview where we have sound money and the market sets interest rates and all these other things that could come at the end of this. Like in the interim, it's going to be excruciating. You're going to see possibly many millions of people starve to death. I mean, what they're doing with farms is so dangerous.
It's already happening, right? I mean, like I still can't remember her first name. Shiva's first name, Dr.
Mandavi. You gotta watch her.
Shiva.
She's so fucking amazing.
So she was.
You should put her in the chat. Or
she was one of the organizers of the seed revolt that happened in India.
Do you remember that when they wanted to do the Monsanto and she did the organic seeds? She really pulled together farmers.
So she created. This is always kind of like a conversation that we're having within the libertarian and the anarchist world, right? It's like, it's not enough to just be able to see the problems and be against them, right? Like, you're not helping unless you're helping to build the alternative or what happens after the fall, right? Like you could be the greatest prognosticator, you could be fucking Nostradamus, but that doesn't help anyone, right? Like it doesn't.
Well, it helps if you're informing people, but otherwise,
it does. But hopefully you're at least motivating them, right? Like to then create like whatever comes next, right?
Well, that's always a big aspect of my show, is I'm trying to fire people up to go and take, financial control of their lives, to realize that like their employment situation, no matter how stable it feels right now, is probably very tenuous, whether they know it or not. And to start to take like an entrepreneurial path, start to create or at least learn the skills so that you can sustain yourself when the fucking system eats shit. Like if it's hunting or if it's farming or whatever, like all of these things. And believe me, I was never a prepper, but I totally sound like one now. I was never, ever a prepper, but I'm telling you, like, if you don't have some of these skills, or if you don't have financial resources, you don't have Bitcoin, you don't have gold, you don't have silver, you don't have guns, you don't have ammo, you don't have a farm, you don't have, well, then fucking forget it, dude. Just enjoy the gulag, because you ain't going to make it.
Yeah. No, it's we talk about that all the time, because like you even thought it was a little crazy when I first started going down this road, and all of a sudden like, the pieces came to play. Like
because they always had this one store.
We have food storage. I mean, like I've always been a pro 2A person, but like I've gotten into firearms big time. I've also gotten into a lot of other areas that would have to do with self-sustainability and kind of like we were looking at moving to New Hampshire at one point in time. It just wasn't in the cards. So we're homesteading in New Jersey. Like I'll be behind enemy lines when the shit goes down, right?
Yeah.
I'll be defending the cucumber plants with my AR, but
from the chipmunk.
Yeah. Well, no, not just the chipmunk. I'm gonna eat that son of a bitch. But anyway, but no, it's so this woman, the way they fought back against
amazing
the basically the true fascism, like it was a perfect example of fascism. You had Monsanto and other ag companies that essentially paired with the Indian government and other outside influences to then create this pressure cooker for farmers, where they were required to comply to certain regulations, use certain types of seeds. If they tried to organically farm and the GMO seeds then cross-pollinated with yours, Monsanto then sued you or like took your property or said that you couldn't, use your own seeds. She was a badass. She would just start seed banks. And she was like, she would just give these because they had a rash, and if anyone wasn't paying attention, I think she said the number was 400,000 farmers in India
Committed
over
suicide?
a period of 10 years committed suicide because in
God.
their culture, it's a great deal of honor too. So like if you're a farmer and your crop fails, like you feel like you failed your family and you failed like your heritage and stuff. You basically commit harry-carry.
Yep.
They had 400,000 male farmers that
She was
basically
like
killed
the
themselves.
other week. She said something like a certain amount of people killed just committed suicide just that week, and that was
Yeah.
last week.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, it's
and-
crazy.
I mean, it's
And
continuing.
I don't think people are extrapolating this out either. This isn't exclusively India. You have the South African farmers have similar
yeah.
issues, but it's usually them being murdered. Then you also have in the Netherlands. I mean, fortunately those farmers for the most part didn't decide to kill themselves, but they decided to rise up instead.
Right.
I mean, but if you see this happening in multiple countries simultaneously,
It
you have to
says
start
something.
asking yourself why. Why
Yeah.
is this happening,
And then
and
you
how
have-
is it happening?
And then you have Bill Gates buying up our farmland.
Yeah.
And fucking
Exactly.
all kinds of shit.
And then
So-
and then you have to conclude that it's all coincidental. If you don't
Yeah.
want to be a fucking
Yeah.
conspiracy theorist. It's like, come on,
It was
man.
just by accident.
So
Yeah.
there was actually I've shared this sound bit with you, or at least I kind of replied to you on Twitter with it. One of the most poignant things I ever heard was a commodities trader while oil was still at like 80 or 90 and on the rise. I still think oil's going back up. I mean, it already started going back up today, but when oil was on the rise, he basically made the comment. He said, "This is the revenge of the old economy. You've essentially chose progressivism over the old world economies of energy production, food production, basic materials and manufacturing, and you've chosen tech. You've chosen, the metaverse. Like, think of like the most pretentious freaking champagne
Not the
socialist
farmers.
idea that you could build an economy on, and it's the fucking metaverse, right?"
I think that's
and-
a really profound point. Let me just highlight it real quick. Is that
Yeah.
if you get so detached from reality that you believe that like you can create a viable alternative life that's in the internet space,
Yeah.
well then obviously you've already become very detached, psychologically from the physical needs to sustain life on the planet. And I
Yes.
think that's like we haven't really even come to terms with how dangerous this mentality is of like your avatar online, as long as it has a dope wardrobe, it doesn't matter that you don't have food in your fucking apartment.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
this is a really dangerous way to look at things.
Yeah.
Well, we always talk about like this is a constant conversation with us, which is like how far from nature in the natural order of things are we from as human beings in our culture, and like
Yep.
we're constantly striving to like connect back. I mean, you look like pharmaceutical with the whole COVID thing, I mean everything.
Yep.
We're so far from
Mhm.
our natural way of being. And, just like knowing how to hunt, knowing how to garden, knowing how to take care of yourself, knowing,
Yeah.
how to survive. We're so fucking far. I mean,
Well,
if it
perfect
came
example.
down-
Look, I have more conversations, face to face through this camera
yeah,
than I do people in real life. I mean, and
Yeah.
that's
for
that
real.
can't
We
be
have
healthy.
3 kids.
Yeah.
Well, so let me dovetail that into the 2027 thing.
Oh,
okay?
it's so good.
So,
We're gonna blow your mind.
we-
It's
we-
gonna
All right, lay
be
it
just
on me.
what you want.
I need another
introduced this-
conspiracy, please.
Well, it goes more into the kind of like spiritual hippie dippy kind of world.
Metaphysical,
Right?
kind
So,
of
Okay.
astrological.
so we introduced this to Forest Mommy yesterday, and
I think
Was she
you guys
into it?
mentioned
Was
this
she
when I
feeling
was on with Jeffrey Tucker. I think.
we probably talked about it a little bit because we really kind of like went
We
in depth
went
with
in.
it yesterday.
We went deep.
Okay.
We're gonna have someone
but-
on who's gonna
Yeah, so
explain it all really well.
We'll talk
for
more
us.
on length
Okay,
about
cool.
it, but we're exiting this period of what in human
Wait, you
design.
have to explain human design because he doesn't know what it is.
Well, no, I mean like really quickly. Human design is like if you took like astrology,
I Ching,
numerology,
Kabbalah, Tree of Life,
like a bunch of stuff and put it
numerology.
together.
He's like, oh my god,
that's
I'm
human
done.
design. Okay?
I'm
Bear with
listening,
me
I'm
because
listening.
I'm with you, Clint. Like I'm a super skeptic.
Yeah,
right?
I'm not. He is.
I haven't even said anything. You guys are assuming I'm skeptical.
I
I don't
know.
even know where you're going with this.
We're insane.
So the kind of like premise of this is that the world has different ages, right? I think you can see that throughout history naturally. It's just a lot of people look back this also kind of looks forward to see it, right? And so we're coming out of this age, which they call the cross-up planning, which is
1640
from
to
1640 until
2027
2027 is this age of industrialization, centralization of power, the building up of these large institutions that, you know, the masses become dependent on, or
it's kind of like giving your power
toward, right?
away to a centralized power, right?
So 2027 is defined as this point in time where we then enter into this age of true decentralization, where the individual spirituality, and then local community
power,
right, become extremely more important than all of these kind of like legacy, you know, institutions and centralized edifices that we've come to depend on. Whether you get there from you know, you believe in like Judeo-Christian God, whether you're a Buddhist, whether you're like, it doesn't matter. And whether or not the actual date is true or not, for me at least as a skeptic, doesn't really matter. But it just rings true to what you're seeing around the planet, right? You're seeing Sri Lankans and the people in the Netherlands. You're seeing, you know, freaking truckers in Canada, as well as independent truckers in California that are freaking exiting the state en masse, right? You're seeing these people that are taking
we're
back
taking our
power,
we're
right?
taking back the power. Although they say with 2000, and it's supposed to be like February 2027, but they say like what we're doing now, so because it's like 1640 to 2027, we've been in a period of midwifing this birth into 220. I love the word midwife. Going into 2027, we have not started pushing it. So a lot of people out there are saying we are in for some massive fucking shit, down to the part where learn how to survive on your own. Kind of like they like centralize, like we haven't pushed yet. So they're still pushing back. Centralized stuff is still pushing back. And when it comes to the point where it's time to push, shit could go down.
Yeah.
And
well, I think it's really very probable.
System.
Yeah, I think it's very probable that the contractions will consist of many wars, potentially some civil wars across the globe. I don't know if I'll ever make it out to New Jersey. That's a pretty blue
crazy
land
place.
But I mean, this is what I just had Scott Horton on, 2 weeks ago to talk all about nuclear proliferation, or hopefully denuclearization at some point. When it comes to weapons, obviously, energy-wise, I love it, but the weapons, horrified of it, and I think that the games we're playing with Russia right now, and toying with World War III, are absolutely horrifying, and I don't think people are paying nearly enough attention to it. Like they are pushing this like 24/7 from the political establishment, regardless of the fact that it's pretty unpopular amongst the American people, if not super unpopular. So it's but to your point about this kind of a maximized period of centralization, I don't really buy into the the religious or any of the spiritual reasons for it.
But yeah,
I'm just saying I don't. That's not how my brain works. Like if it works for you, that's fine. But the way I see it is like this is just a natural cycle of human behavior where you give enough of your autonomy away, and it gets to a point of being so unbearable that you then claw it back. And if the clawing involves violence, then so be it. That's just kind of how people have behaved historically. And I think that we are nearing that apex of people just going like, okay, this system is so enormous and so powerful and so corrupt, and it provides me nothing that it promises, and it provides me nothing that I demand. Well, then it has to go. It just has to. So that's what I think is going to happen.
And what I thought about it the other day is I was thinking about the time frames, right? Since 1640 to 2027. If we're coming to like a climax of that, that means we haven't seen anywhere near what's going to happen since 1640, which is like, holy fuck, like shit's happened between 1640 and now.
Yeah.
Like how bad could it get is what's in my mind. Like,
well, you don't even have to go back to 1640 though, because there's the what's the 20-year cycle that goes in 80-year waves, like wave theory or whatever. I think there's a bunch of analysis that coincides with what you're talking about. There's also economic wave analysis that people believe in. So I think however you analyze it, you're very probably correct that in the next 5 years we're going to see cataclysmic
it's
changes.
not only human design, it's like across a bunch of things that are saying it for sure.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it's a scary prospect, but beautiful at the same time. Individual freedom, individual power, take care. How good is that going to feel when people's lives are more meaningful and their families and their
Well,
like
it can be. I mean, the thing is like I don't like these types of concepts simply because I have taken so much more personal autonomy over the past couple years during, one of the most tyrannical periods. Like I hate it when I say, well, by 2027, this shit's gonna like,
Yeah.
it's gonna be rough, but
Yeah.
it'll get better. And I'm just like, no,
Yeah.
no, no, no. Like it gets better because of human action. Like
Yes.
that's how I view it. So
I
I would rather
100%
encourage
agree.
people to push towards that goal, whether it ends up happening in 2027 or 2030 or 2035. Like I think it only comes to pass that ultimate outcome is positive if people with our worldview are actually dictating or instilling our will into that ether. So I hope.
So saying that human action, what would be your kind of advice? What kind of human action should we be taking?
Well, like I always say, entrepreneurial path is like that's the primary mechanism to sustain your existence, and it also can be the primary time consumption in your life. So like, why would you not want it to be your own baby? To me, it just seems like a natural thing, especially if you're a liberty-minded person. Like it just seems perfect for you.
Yep.
So if you have any skills that are unique, try and find a way to monetize it. Try and find a way to make some money off of it so that you can take that hobby and make it replace whatever your corporate slave job is.
Yeah. What's super interesting to me is the people right now who think that they have skills or skill sets that make them successful in the way the current world works or doesn't work. Actually, they're going to be caught wanting, right? Like, when the shit hits the fan, like, I don't think, Instagram influencer is going to be a skill set that people need, right? I think back to, like, I've met tons of people that are like, their like hobby is like blacksmithing and
That's hot. I like that.
like just trade skill people like carpenters and things like that, right? Like, or people who can grow food. Those things,
just being
like,
a fucking plumber, dude. You're gonna be
like
rich.
Yes, yeah, right. Like,
yeah.
And
we paid a lot of money to
and
our plumber.
those people have been shit on for probably the better part of 20 years. Like, basically, dumb blue collar people, which is probably why Trump had the rise that he had, was because he appealed to those folks as opposed to the the aristocracy. But we were just talking about this before. It's really interesting that people that will get down on you for, like, victim blaming and this kind of shit, just ask them where they stand on the farmers in the Netherlands or the truckers in Canada, and like, they'll be like, oh, well, no, those people are insurrectionists and they're like, they're causing harm.
They're evil.
And you're like, do you understand that they've been like, do you understand the kind of life? And
it's
then
then
my brain clicks and I'm like, no, obviously you don't, because you freaking just went to Starbucks and got a latte and you work a freaking bullshit job pushing paper. Like, obviously,
not to mention the fact that the Netherlands is the second biggest exporter of agriculture in the world. It's like your capacity to eat is dependent on them winning this fight. Like, whether you know it or not, like, there's a decent chance that huge swaths of Africa starves to death if they don't win that fight. Like, that's real shit. And if you're pretending to be some bleeding heart liberal and you're laughing at these white farmers because you think that they've got privilege or some shit, well, just keep in mind that you're completely ignoring their customer base, the people that actually eat that food, you piece of garbage. Like, I can't stand these people. And it's the same way I feel about Sri Lanka. It's the same way I feel about many of the Latin American countries that are revolting right now because of inflation and terrible monetary policy and the shortages of food and fuel. It's like all of this is really a battle of, like, looking out for the little guy. And I don't really do that overtly. It's just like, it breaks my heart that these people are truly victims of a system that they don't understand, and they've really had no say in the creation of it. It's awful and it's evil. And if you're going to, pretend to be a lefty, you ought to be on the side of these people at a minimum.
Yeah. Which the left used to. They
Yeah.
It
used to be
changed.
on that side, but when
In
they
the
got
90s, they were okay.
yeah, when they got well, I mean, like Bill Clinton is a very defining line between the old left and the new left, right? That corporate takeover of the left happened pretty fucking quickly, right? But just to harken back to like the Tyler Durden line, right? Like we're the people that serve you your food, like we're the people that keep you safe at night. Do not fuck with us, right? Like
Right.
that thought process rings true, especially when we think what is going to happen economically is going to happen. So,
And I don't think people understand how tenuous an economy that has to provide, energy and food and all sorts of other goods, clothing, et cetera, to 7+ billion people is. Like,
mhm.
that is an incredibly, like, almost miraculous concoction of human drive and innovation and
Oh,
spirit.
it's Friedman's
It
story of the pencil, right? Like it's
Yeah.
unbelievable, right?
Yeah, but I mean, he was writing that when we had maybe 4 billion or 5 billion people on the planet. We're up to like 7.5. I think we're about to approach 8 by like 2 months from now. Like that, when you consider the amount of production that's necessary to sustain those people, you cannot fuck with that system for an extended period of time and expect it not to, on the margins, start to wipe out that population. And this is why I personally believe that we are ruled by Malthusians that believe that the world is overpopulated, and they are okay with sacrificing those people, contrary to whatever they espouse when it comes to equity and looking out for the little guy and alleviating racial tensions. The people that are going to die from this are largely black, and they're in Africa, and they don't give a fuck about that.
Yeah.
So just drop
they
the
also
rhetoric.
they also don't have $2 to their name to steal, right? Like that's the other thing, right? Like they want, like, those people can die, right? Like the people that they need to live are the ones that they can continue to thieve from, right? So
Right.
I mean that also bakes into the equation, whether it's conscious or subconscious.
I have like a lot
Yeah.
of thoughts. One being the whole entrepreneurship thing is so interesting to me because we have and you're like saying with like being a plumber, it wasn't cool for so long, right?
Yeah.
But like everybody has a different love for something. And I was just looking into like the ideas of cave art, and the earliest 50,000 years ago, they have cave art, and people were doing art in corners of fucking caves. Like it's like, to think of what entrepreneurship can be, right? Like it's okay to have an inspiration to be an artist, and you can make something of that, and you can and be a farmer and be like, art has survived 50,000 fucking years. The stock market hasn't.
But no. But hold on. Trade and commerce has been at the cornerstone of human development.
Well, yeah.
But to your point, even art is under attack. Like, just what is amazing is what Eric D. July is doing right now with his launch. Launch of this comic book brand is fucking believable. I
think
hope
he's at
that dude makes
$2.5
$100 fucking million. I hope he topples DC and Marvel, because fuck them. They bought into the freaking, like, you go woke, you go broke. Like, I'm sorry, that's just the way it works.
No, but you only go broke if a competitor rises up to make you go broke, and because of ESG, it makes it extraordinarily challenging for that competitor to arise.
Yes.
So this is why I'm fighting on the ESG side of things, because I am a spokesperson. Basically, that's like what I do now, and I think that it's important, if we're going to get people to support independent creators like Eric July, they need to understand why they're doing it. It can't just be like, okay, the product's better, okay, yeah, that's cool, but like there's also a bigger reason to do it, is that you should be punishing the people that have been trying to control your culture and your way of thinking, your way of living for the past 20 years. Like, fuck these people. Like, that's the main, like, I think a huge amount of the money that's going to Eric July right now, or to Ripaverse, is a product of anger. That's anger towards the woke takeover of that industry. And every industry has been taken over by the woke via ESG. So I'm trying to get people to understand this is why. And now once you understand why, you can operate both from a sense of fury, but also knowing why you're upset, knowing that it was actually the UN and BlackRock and Larry Fink and Bill Gates and State Street and Vanguard and all these, the biggest money managers on earth,
Schwab.
and Klaus Schwab and the World
Yeah.
Economic Forum. Like, you can actually understand this is why it happened. And now you know who your enemy is and you know who your allies are. And then you can go out and support the right people.
Well, so interesting. Like, so we love, I don't know if you love him, but I love Russell Brand. I think he's
I love him.
phenomenal.
Yeah, he's awesome.
And he had someone on I don't know if you watch him normally, but he had someone on the other day was talking about newspapers and I actually don't even know her name or exactly what. I just listened to snippets that make sense to me. And you were talking about how I feel like it was like the 30s up to the 50s. They used to have like media was much different, and they used to have all these communist papers. So like it was a local kind of thing, like, and it wasn't like it was the people who couldn't do the traditional jobs. They would always go and they could go and work for a communist paper or something. We don't have that media anymore. Like we don't have that outlet anymore, even though we have this, right? We have the social media, which is also very much tracked and stuff, right? But they used to have these communist papers where people, the everyday blue collar fucking person who is the majority of our, country and our culture in a lot of ways, like they had this outlet and they could pick from 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 communist, well, they say communist papers because we're talking about a time frame, but like they, and they had all this opportunity to be something different and to hear different viewpoints. And now you just,
well, to a credit to Eric D. July, and this is also a common trend. Like, so Joss is writing a book on grief, right? And the one point I try to make to her is that, you could try and kind of like, prostrate yourself before the big publishing houses and all this other stuff, but you then fall victim to, their biases, their viewpoint, right? Like their ESG score is what they're worried about.
You'll never be able to create what you intend to if you
exactly.
Yeah, that's what I've been
so
messing
this,
with.
like, look at the way Malice freaking, I'm like freaking Anarchist Handbook, right? This guy didn't go to a big freaking publishing house, right? He freaking developed his own audience. No, he made his own shit. No, he developed his own audience, and then like it's the other, like Gary Vee talks about it all the time, as much as like whether you think Gary Vee's a positive influence or not, like he's got some smart ideas. He said create the audience and then build the products, right? You don't build the products first. Like you have to figure out what they actually want to talk about.
But unless your product is a personal product, it has to happen at a certain time. See, like Amazon and stuff, it's so fucked up because anyone can get a bestseller on Amazon if they give it away.
Yeah.
For free.
You just give it away for free and play the game. Yeah.
It's such bull. Like I don't even really believe in that. So we were talking about like just
no.
I'm a bookmaker anyways.
Malice gave away shit for free.
That's what I'm saying.
Nothing. No, I mean, he gave away nothing for free and became a bestseller.
That's what I'm saying.
Because his audience, like Eric's audience, is freaking voracious. And so, to your point, Clint, I agree with you. Like you have to not necessarily weaponize, but you have to tap into that either ire or the disenfranchisement or just the overall like disappointment in what some of these things that people grew up knowing as high quality have now been diluted or have been, basically contorted into what they are now.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Do you have, I don't know what you have where you live, but what we don't really have local papers anymore. Our voice is not heard within our community or,
Well, like the Miami Herald, is that like now part of a bigger paper? Because like a ton of our papers have just gotten bought up.
Yeah.
Who knows? I haven't read a newspaper in a long time. I mean, if I do read anything, it's going to be online. So I'm certainly not getting physical papers. I have no idea. I mean, I think that it's being replaced by social media. The censorship is obviously a huge issue, but we're finding ways, we're finding ways to, like, Substack is kind of a response to the suppression of dissident thought that was happening online. And now you have people that are making enormous sums of money being independent writers through that avenue. Locals is another great example of independent creators that are making videos or podcasts or whatever else that are able to, monetize their efforts. And speaking from experience, I basically poured my soul into Twitter for the past 3 years, just growing a Twitter following. And then I started a podcast 2 years ago when I had a very minor following. And then, it slowly progressed. And now, I'm not making a huge amount of money, but like I could live off of this income from my podcast. And that's crazy to me. I broke into an industry that has millions of competitors. It's like, it's not, it's a pretty saturated market, and it's very hard
All you need are
you're
1,000 true fans.
But you're not saying what the rest of them are. That's the other thing is like,
true.
You know, I mean, just take it back to the Ron Paul line. Like, you just have to be brave, right? Like, in an ocean of people that are going in one direction, just be brave enough to paddle in the opposite direction. And you might not end up having the same volume of fans. You might not end up making tens of millions of dollars, but you'll end up with a freaking diehard, passionate group of people that follow you.
Yep.
It's
the only criteria is that you're sincere and that you stick to it. Like, if
authentic.
if you're authentic, that's what I meant by sincere. But same, exactly.
I was just echoing you.
I'm just saying, like, that's the main differentiator from the podcast realm versus every other medium, is that the people that have already given up on all other aspects of mainstream media, those are the people that have usually migrated to the podcast realm, because they're like, I am one of those people. I fell in love with podcasts when I discovered Joe Rogan in 2009 or 10, like in episode 50, and he's up to 2000 something now. It's like, these are the people that really became the early adopters and the most passionate customers of the podcast circuit. Is like, we wanted something different. And the difference is largely authenticity. So the key, in my opinion, is that no matter how big you grow, if you can't maintain that authenticity, you will stop growing. And I think that's really the difference between someone who ends up with a modicum of success, say 5 to 10,000 listeners, and someone who ends up with 100,000 to 1 million listeners. Like, that's really what separates it.
Oh yeah. All right, dude. I feel
like
through a lot.
We've gone through what to do with the coming situation. We've gone over what might happen, what's probably going to happen. We talked digital currency. We talked 2027.
Dude, there's so much more we could go through, but so plug where people can find you if they're not currently subbed to you.
Sure. It's at Liberty Lock Pod on Twitter, and it is Liberty Lockdown, 2 words, Liberty Lockdown, on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, everywhere else. I should be having on Josie, the redheaded libertarian, probably next week. I've had on some really big guests, obviously Scott Horton. God, I can't even remember Jason Burak, who blew my mind with his economic analysis. He's an independent, basically money manager, advisor, and Fed analyst. That episode is doing gangbusters numbers. Like, we're over 10,000 already. I don't know, man. Just check it out. If you guys like my analysis, for those that don't know, I was a money manager for 15 years. That's where I get this, formulation background, mindset. And also, my dad was a libertarian and he raised me. So that's why I come at basically every aspect of life with kind of a libertarian, independent minded perspective.
Homeschooled?
No,
I was not. I went to public school.
Were you vaccinated?
As a kid, maybe. I don't know. I don't know.
Where
as a baby.
Come from?
Yeah. No, as a baby, I probably was, but I honestly don't know. I'd have to ask my parents. But no, I was not vaccinated in the past 2 years. I can assure you
I'm
that.
like one of the very few 45-year-olds who's never had a vaccine in my body. There's very few of us. I meet them every so often.
No, we were talking to Hex yesterday, and Hex is the same.
But he's too young. He's at 45.
Yeah. He's like early 20s. He looks like. I don't even know.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. Yeah,
okay.
Era. I'm impressed.
But as a kid, I probably got vaccinated. I don't know. My mom was, or my dad was very opposed. So maybe not. I don't know.
Maybe cool not. That would be awesome. You would be like in my crew.
I'm impressed that you haven't been blocked by the redheaded libertarian. Because
yes, I know. Well, hey, in fairness, I block people about as aggressively as she does. So if you're not blocked by either myself or Josie, then tune in and enjoy the episode. So we'll have 5 listeners.
I'm surprised I'm not blocked. I like half of her stuff, and then half the stuff we kind of like go back and forth on. But no, it's all good. We have Ace Anarchist coming on next week to talk about what actually is anarchy. So that should be good. And then I'm trying to line up Shane Hazel.
We're going to talk holistic health.
Yeah, we're going to talk about health.
I'm so into that one.
Just went through his back and everything like that. So we'll talk about a little bit.
Awesome.
Of that.
By the way, I was on Kibbe for Liberty with Matt Kibbe.
Yeah.
Just came out last week, and I broke down ESG for his audience, and he's he's floating the idea of me going on with Glenn Beck to break it down for his audience. So that would be
That would be
Ooh, That
awesome.
would be
enormous if that
great.
happens. So
Maybe,
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
maybe you could make Glenn Beck libertarian again. I would like that to happen.
Wear it on a
he's
hat.
close. He's close. I'm telling you. Dave was just on there a couple months ago. If he has me on, obviously he's tight with Kibbe. He also Eric July is a contributor over at The Blaze, which is Glenn Beck's organization. I think Glenn is way more libertarian than most people want to give him credit, but he's also, he's had some missteps from a libertarian perspective. So.
Yeah. There's been a couple of, and you know what? The Libertarian Party hasn't done anything to keep him.
No, no, we didn't
in that lane.
Exactly right.
So, all right, dude, Clint, thank you very much.
Awesome.
I appreciate it. We will check everyone next week, Monday, 9 p.m. Eastern live. And that's it.
That's it.
Peace. Talk to you later.